It is kind of amazing to be standing up here and have the opportunity to introduce this panel with Dean Spade and Laura Whitehorn. Dean Spade is an organizer and a trans activist and attorney who founded the Sylvia Rivera Law Project in 2002, a collective that provides free legal services in New York and works to build trans resistance. He is the author of this book, Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of the Law, which he actually presented here last year, and we're really, really thrilled to have him back in Baltimore. Laura Whitehorn is a longtime political activist and organizer and a former political prisoner. Since her release from prison in 1999, she's worked and lived in New York City as an advocate and ally for our incarcerated comrades and for prison justice organizers around the world. It is an honor to moderate this panel. These are two of the most inspiring organizers and activists that I personally have ever met, and I'm so thrilled to welcome them on behalf of Red Emma's and on behalf of the Book Festival to Baltimore. So thank you so much for coming out to do this event. So the format, very quickly, for what we're going to do is Dean will speak first, and then Laura. They'll each have 10 to 15 minutes to just kind of give you an overview of their work, what they've been working on or writing about. And then we're going to give them a chance to kind of respond to each other, so try and catalyze a conversation between these two organizers. And then, of course, we're going to leave ample time to open it up and bring all of you into the conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dean.
Cool, thanks. Thanks so much to Kate and to Red Emma's for organizing this and for all the amazing work they do, and also introducing me to the wonderful city of Baltimore. Not loud enough? Better? Louder? Good? Okay. So I'm just going to quick and dirty a few of the themes of the book. So this book came out of my work at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. For those who are unfamiliar, that organization is providing free legal help to low-income people and people of color who are trans, intersex, and gender nonconforming. So we basically provide legal help to people who are facing an enormous amount of poverty, homelessness, and criminalization. And for a lot of people, immigration enforcement also that's related to criminalization, especially these days. And the things that lead to that are really significant economic marginalization of those folks. In today's economy, people are pretty much excluded from the labor force by really strong discrimination. People don't hire trans people. And a lot of people are pushed pretty heavily into criminalized employments like drug work and sex work to get by. That's a pretty central common theme. And people are also really heavily excluded from social services. As I'm sure you've noticed, almost all the social service sort of programs, the very limited, crappy safety net we have in the United States, so what the threads of it that are left, are all organized through gender segregation. So places like homeless shelters, foster care group homes, all these places are men's, women's, boys, and girls. And if you don't fit that, then you face enormous amounts of violence in those systems or exclusion from them. Like a lot of our clients, all the drug treatment centers would just reject them. We don't take people like that. We don't know what to do with them. They are going to be disruptive, things like that. Or a lot of people are trying to access services like that. Like we had a lot of clients who are trans women who are homeless, trying to access homeless shelters in New York City, and they'd be sent to this giant men's shelter, Ward's Island, and it's just a guarantee of sexual assault, harassment, violence, so they just wouldn't enter the shelter system because it wasn't a realistic option. It was more dangerous than the incredibly dangerous option of sleeping on the street or trying to find a way to have a place to sleep that night. So people were really in extreme poverty, and then also not even able to grasp any tiny thread of the benefit system or the shelter system, things like that. And of course, in our culture, if people are poor, they are criminalized, right? It's a crime to sleep outside. It's a crime to pee on the sidewalk because you can't go into a business and buy something and pee. It's right? Everything about being poor is criminal, and especially being homeless is criminal. And also, being a gender nonconforming person brings a lot of police attention, especially for trans women of color who are always profiled as sex workers. And often are involved in criminalized work to survive. So all these folks are being funneled into a criminal punishment system, which is also gender segregated, and which also has extremely high consequences for people who are gender variant, gender outside in any way. The amounts of sexual assault inside prisons against all people in prisons, and often especially targeted at people who appear gender nonconforming, queer, or trans, are very high. A lot of our clients reported being enforced prostitution rings run by guards inside prisons. One of the myths about prison rape is that it's primarily between prisoners, but it's really actually coordinated by the people who our tax money goes to employ inside the prisons, because the culture of prisons is really about sexual violence. So the people we saw were facing that, had survived that, or were surviving that, and there was just an incredible amount of violence in their lives that really honestly just ends people's lives sooner, right? Like that one of the things we saw was that a lot of our clients face early death, both from direct violence and also from long-term denial of health care, from nutritional deprivation while inside prisons, from not getting their meds while inside immigration detention, et cetera. And of course, in today's sort of immigration, criminalization, devolution, all of our clients who had potential immigration problems, those are really heightened by how criminalized the community is. Okay, so that's like sort of the bad story of what I was seeing all the time in these systems I was working in. And so if you live in the United States, the story on the street is if you're part of a community that faces terrible economic marginalization, what's called discrimination, state violence, you should try to change the law. Like you should try to fight for your rights. That's like the story in our country. And that story is a story that in many ways is centrally an anti-black story in the US. It's a story about how supposedly we live in a country that used to have anti-black racism, used to have slavery, used to have racial apartheid, and supposedly it was resolved by changes to law. Right, that's like a bit, and so now we live in a post-racist society, supposedly, where if you're doing poorly, it's because you're lazy or it's your fault, right? This is the whole mythology of the United States. It's very centered in anti-black racism. Although this story is also told about other aspects, like supposedly we've resolved sexism by law, supposedly we've resolved ableism, yet we know the real realities, right? That disability, racism, sexism are things that cause like consistent economic marginalization, over-criminalization of certain populations, state violence targeted at certain people. But there's this kind of story about it, right? So a lot of my work is thinking about what does this story mean for people in trans communities who are being told that we should try to change the law to change our lives? Like, what does that story mean? And one thing I want to observe in this is that in the period in the United States when supposedly we've all become like legally equal, right? The period in which we've had like civil rights law and we've all supposedly been declared equal under the law, and there's been hate crimes laws and anti-discrimination laws passed. During this same period, we've seen actually growing material inequality in the United States, right? So obviously, the decolonize, Occupy movement has really mobilized people thinking about the severe wealth and income gap in the United States, the growing wealth divide, right? So that's one thing we can see is that material inequality has grown in that way, and that's a very racialized wealth and income divide in the United States, as it has always been, right? Which has been talked about, unfortunately, less sometimes in the headlines around that movement. So this growing wealth gap that's contributed to by things like attacks on labor. It's harder than ever to try to get a fair deal with your bosses by striking, things like that. That's been, labor law has really been really harsh, especially since Reagan, and forced people to have less bargaining power with their bosses. Free trade agreements have ensured that corporations can make more money by exploiting more people and more environments all over the world, and workers get a worse deal everywhere. We've had a sort of really significant attack on welfare and dismantling of any poverty alleviation services or benefits that even minor way existed in the United States. The actual benefit of welfare, the actual amount of welfare benefits has reduced, and the number of people who are eligible for them has really significantly reduced. It's just really hard to get them. And in all this period, we've also had this drastically growing set of apparatuses of racialized violence and growing global warfare from the United States, right? So we also see, the explosion of criminalization in the United States. I'm sure many people have heard this statistic that the United States is the most imprisoning country in the world. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. And we're the most imprisoning country that has ever existed in the world. We're the largest prison project known to humankind, right? Like we put more people in cages than anybody's ever done that, right? And our immigration system is growing at a rapid rate as well. Just since 2001, we've quadrupled the number of people we have in immigration prisons. And Obama has broken records by deporting more than 400,000 people every year in the last 2 years, right? And he's like, on to the next, let's keep it going. So we've seen this period where supposedly we resolved racism, sexism, ableism, et cetera, through law, yet actual conditions for the people who are supposedly protected by those laws have worsened in like an extremely material way. So this is like a big problem for activists. Like, what does this mean about whether or not legal reform is a good route for us? So I come to this from the perspective of doing this work in trans communities, where the logic that you hear a lot frequently, especially from sort of the way gay and lesbian organizations, is that what trans people should do is we should try to pass anti-discrimination laws and hate crimes laws, and that's what's going to save our lives, right? And that is a little bit fishy, right, given these conditions. A, because we know anti-discrimination law hasn't actually resolved or even addressed the significant housing, healthcare, and employment disparities that still exist for people of color, for women, et cetera, the wage gaps, all of that. It's been on the books for 40, 50 years, and it hasn't seemed to have done something about that, right? And we know that those kinds of laws do nothing for prisoners, do nothing for people on welfare. They don't even reach into those realms from a legal perspective, right? And I think for a lot of us, hate crimes laws are potentially some of the most insidious logics because, of course, our people are getting killed all the time. So we want to do something about that. And what we're told is the thing you should do about that is expand the punishing power of the system that is the primary perpetrator of violence against your community, right? So we should expand the thing that actually kills us the most, that rapes us the most, the thing that actually is the thing we fear the most, right? That somehow it's going to protect us when we actually know it doesn't protect us. It's never protected us. So it's this kind of co-optation of our grief and our experience of violence. So the book is about this idea, like, what does it mean to let go of the notion of having the state declare us equal and actually try to change the material conditions of our lives? And how do we engage with law in that? And I come to this from a perspective of legal services and being a lawyer. So I've tried to just talk about what I've seen, what I'm calling critical trans politics that I see a lot of activists and communities practicing. And that's a politics that's suspicious of invitations to be recognized under the law. And it says, it's not what the law says about us that we care about, it's what the law is doing to our communities. It's about how we're being deported, how we're being locked in cages. That's what we care about. We're not interested in having it wrap a big old rainbow flag around that prison or around that, cop or whatever. We actually know what that thing is, right? We're concerned about that. So that law reform is not a goal of our movements. It may be a tactic at times, but it's not our goal. And even when it is a tactic, it's actually a pretty dangerous tactic that we use with care, that we want to ask questions like, is this thing going to give any material relief to the people who are worst off, this thing that we're talking about? Or is it just symbolic? Is it just window dressing for the system? Oh, the system cares about trans people now. Continue to kill and destroy, right? And who does it ever divide us from each other? Does it say, this is going to really help out people except for undocumented people, unemployed people, people on welfare? That's what most law reforms do. They offer something that's available only to sort of the least endangered of the group that's sort of facing the concerns. They kind of help us just cream off the top people who are most likely to already have access to their basic needs. And part of the sort of logic of this critical trans politics is that we should start with the people who are facing the worst dangers of transphobia, right? We should start that we don't believe in trickle down anything. I hope everybody's in agreement with me on that, right? And that we actually think social justice only trickles up. So if we solve a problem of a white trans law professor who has trouble using the bathroom at his school, or his colleagues are transphobic, we won't have solved the problem for the person in the detention center who's trans down the street, who's being raped and not also having enough to eat and has all those issues. But if we solve the problem for that person, inevitably it will have reached. Right. So it's like the idea that you would start first with the people with the sort of most gaping wounds, with the most closeness to death, right? That's actually sort of a moral and ethical position as well. And doing that work involves sort of three main elements from what I'm seeing. One element is doing work that's about survival, so supporting people in our communities right now who are in the grips of these systems, who are trying to get public benefits, who are facing deportation, who are in our prisons and jails, doing direct support to help each other survive, and doing that not from a charity perspective of, oh, I'm going to help you if I decide that you're the deserving poor, and if you're homeless, there's probably something wrong with you, you probably need to pee in a cup and be home by 10 and take a medication, and not this kind of typical social services model in the United States that says white professionals can decide who of the poor deserves, assistance, but instead a mutual aid model, by and for model, a model of, wow, we're all having this problem, let's get together and help each other survive it and also figure out how to get at the root causes of it and destroy a system that harms us, right? So a very different model, and we can talk more about that if you want. A second strategy or set of strategies is about dismantling these systems. So people are doing that all over, including here in Baltimore and DC area and everywhere I go, trying to stop further criminalization. So fighting, for example, here in this region, people have been fighting against prostitution-free zones, fighting against things that enhance criminalization of people doing sex work, fighting new jail and prison building projects and stopping those, right? I was just in Pennsylvania yesterday, really inspired by the group Decarcerate Pennsylvania that's trying to stop that kind of work. People trying to end stop and frisk in New York City, right? People trying to actually stop the processes that are devouring our communities and both decriminalize things and break down these things, close these facilities, and also stop their continued expansion, which is unfortunately something we're still up against, right? People are trying to stop local law enforcement from honoring ICE detainers so they won't hold people for ICE to come get them. All these pieces that are about looking technically at how our people get fed in there and saying no, we're cutting it off. And then the third piece is building alternatives, right? We're living under systems that promise us safety, that promise us economic well-being, and that actually deliver nightmarish violence. what would give us safety? What would help us have the things we need? Our communities are constantly in a process of trying to actually deliver those things to ourselves and each other. So people are doing that by like figuring out alternative food systems, by finding ways of building cooperative housing together, and like housing where you don't have to pay rent, and that kind of stuff. And also by trying to figure out what can we do around violence that does exist in our communities. Since we know we can't call the cops and they just bring more violence, how do we respond? And there's a lot of amazing projects all over the United States and beyond around trying to figure out alternatives to that. I really recommend this book, which is probably for sale over there, called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. A lot of people are really curious about that particular part of this work, and that's a book that's addressing that, that's relatively recent. So I'll just finish by saying, this work is about making really huge demands. So we're not just asking, please name us to be the good guys in law. Please consider me a crime victim instead of a criminal, even though in reality you'll keep criminalizing me. We're not asking for that. We're asking to end prisons, to end borders, to end poverty, to actually have decision-making over our lives and our communities. It's a pretty big deal, and a lot of people say it's impossible. Oh my God, you can't have politics based on this, right? That's sort of the idea. In reality, there is absolutely nothing worth fighting for that's considered possible under these current economic conditions. If they think it's possible on the news, we probably don't want it, and we should in fact be incredibly suspicious of it, right? So part of what a lot of us are trying to do is show that notion that there's no alternative is a huge lie, and it's a conservative lie, and actually we can and are doing a million forms of really important incremental work in our communities that do this survival, dismantling, and building alternatives, and we're doing it right now, and we're going to keep doing it, and we're going to win these things, right? But part of it is having a meaningful goal, not already compromising to extremely conservative system building goals. So I'll end there.
Okay, so that was perfect. I don't know. And I sort of want to take off. I'm just going to start in a different way than I was thinking of, just because of what Dean just said. Because, I started my political career, such as it has been, in the 60s. We tried to make a revolution. And the reason we did that was because we saw around the world that the people that the United States was bombing and invading and colonizing were fighting back and actually winning. And when the Tet Offensive happened in January of '69, I guess, it changed everything. And then black GIs started coming back and infused the black movement with the sense of the capacity to fight and win political power. So Black Power was a realistic slogan, and all of that was going on together. And many of us changed our lives sort of almost on a dime to try to be part of that world revolution. And so now I'm 67 years old, and I did 14 years in prison, and my health sucks, and I'm a wreck from all those years. And people say to me, well, did you really, they think that we're crazy. And I sometimes speak on a platform with Kathleen Cleaver, who was a leader of the Black Panther Party, and she and I have the exact same answer, which was, maybe, but I'd rather try and keep trying than to give up and accept the kind of slow death and that exists in this country. So I love what you said. So it's very emotional for me to be in Baltimore, and I've been at Red Emma's. I love Red Emma's. I love the community here, and thank you all so much. But I was first arrested, no, it wasn't the first time I was arrested, but on my 14-year stint, I was arrested in Baltimore. We had an underground house up on the Alameda, which people may know. We thought we were going to be anonymous, and anyway, long story. And in Baltimore City Jail, a couple of things happened to me. One was that I saw genocide in front of my eyes, so all of my understandings that had been active in the 60s, and this was 1985, were rekindled, because I saw how when you imprison, and this is before we understood mass incarceration. But it's 85, so there were already more people in prison than there had been in the 70s, when around the time of Attica I had started doing work in support of people in prison. But what I saw was women who were being destroyed actively every day by a system that threatened them physically and humiliated them for who they were, took away any kind of connection to a community, separated them from their kids, made sure those kids would not be brought up by their parents and then would have a much harder time in life, and basically kept people from having any sort of hope of education, although, of course, prisons are a place of resistance. And one of the books that I hope that you will leave with today is called Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggle of Incarcerated Women by Victoria Law. And I wrote the introduction for it, and in so doing, I thought a lot about what we did in Baltimore and how I learned about protracted struggle from women there who put together a committee that didn't just fight back against the system, because we didn't have the strength to win very much that was worth winning from them, but that created alternatives inside the prison, created alternatives to what the cops were allowing us to have. So those are some pretty important lessons that I learned. The other thing that happened to me was that I was in Baltimore. I mean, we had come here. We were all from New York or from California, different places, but none of us was from Baltimore, and I knew no one. I had been a leftist in Chicago with the Panthers, in Boston for years, and in New York, but not in Baltimore. So I opened the phone book, I got the phone book, and I started looking up anything that started with committee. And I wrote letters, and I got such a great response from people in Baltimore. So I think Baltimore is a really good example of solidarity, because people who came to, okay, my case was ultimately called the Resistance Conspiracy case. And it was a different era from now, so our sense of revolution was a little different from what it is now. So part of what we had done was a series of bombings of U.S. government targets, including the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol building, when the U.S. invaded Grenada and fired on and shelled Lebanon. So we were opposing not only colonialism against black people in the Western Hemisphere as well as in Africa, but also the United States support for Israeli apartheid, which we weren't calling it that then, but for support for the liberation of Palestine. So there were a series of bombings that we had done. So there I was, I had believed really firmly in armed struggle for revolution. And some of the people who came to visit me, one of the women was wearing a cap. She was from CISPES, I think, Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, and she's wearing this great beret with this button that people might have seen, two hands breaking a gun. And I said, we have so much in common, but my beret would have a fist raising a gun. But my point is, she came in to see me and to offer support, despite the fact that we had, supposedly huge differences. And it turned out we really didn't have such huge differences. So I was a political prisoner, by which I mean a political prisoner can be a number of things. It can be someone who's imprisoned for what they try to say. So it can be someone like Geronimo Gijaga, Geronimo Pratt, who was an activist, a leader in the Black Panthers, who was framed for a murder he didn't commit. The government knew it. They kept him in prison in isolation for 27 years. There are other people like that. It can be people who did something like me, who say, yeah, well, right, we did do that. We were part of political movements that were fighting for liberation, and under international law, you qualify as a political prisoner if you are part of a movement which has as its goals recognized human rights values that are the soul of what makes the earth habitable by people. Or you can be someone who was framed, who did something, but what you're in prison for isn't what you did, but you're not telling on the people who did do it. So there are a lot of ways to be a political prisoner. And just on our way down here, my girlfriend Susie and I visited Eddie Conway, Marshal Eddie Conway, who's a political prisoner, was a Black Panther, and has been in prison for 40 years in Maryland, and is 42 years, yeah, right, I know, but who's counting? And he is an example, because he does enormously amazing ground-building work inside the prison, which some people might actually have been part of going in. I don't know, he does mentoring programs. He's breaking down the disabilities that are imposed on young black men by the influx of violence into communities. I want to make two more points, and then I'll shut up. One is that, and I'm going to do this really fast instead of like talking about it, but okay, so we have in this country a total crisis of mass incarceration, which is what Dean was talking about. And it is a moral, political, and social and economic crisis that calls for, as Angela Davis keeps saying, an abolitionist movement along the lines of what there was of an abolitionist movement around slavery. It's a re-enslavement, primarily, I believe, of black people, also of Latino people, other people of color, immigrant communities. But in my view, the government understands very well that there will never be a revolutionary change unless there is a black revolutionary component to the movement. And so I firmly believe that that is a very big part of mass incarceration. And you can read Michelle Alexander's book. She has pieces of it. A lot of people have pieces of it. The other piece of it is the continued imprisonment of political prisoners for 40 years, and when they're not permitted to, be released like other prisoners on parole. Because you lock up the leaders, destroy the organizations, as the FBI did, on the one hand, the revolutionary organizations, and destroy communities. The last thing I want to say is that this crisis of mass incarceration is a crisis that affects every person in this country because it invades our bones, our brain cells. I mean, we could talk about cop shows, which I have seen, the absolute, explosion of cop shows, and there are good ones. I won't watch The Wire. I know I probably should, but I won't because I think I'm going to end up, I don't know if this is true, you end up being sympathetic with some of the cops. And that, to me, is the whole point. It's trying to get us to accept repression, accept the policing of us. And one way that that operates is that prisons enforce gender roles, they enforce social roles, they enforce race roles, and as the more that we accept that level of punishment that the state is allowed to carry out on bodies in this country, the more that our minds are invaded by it. And we can talk about the school to prisons pipeline, you can talk about the fact that everywhere you go you have to show ID, and that we're used to that, but we are morally destroyed by that. Our ability to think for ourselves, to resist, and to fight for our full humanity is reduced by that. The last thing is we live in a society that is like so divided. And so there are two societies. There's the United States of prisons and there's the United States of outside. But there really is a lot of back and forth, even if you never set foot in the prison. And if we don't tear down the prison system and change it and put alternatives in its place, community control of crime, community control of, as I won't go into, as Dean was talking about, then we will end up selling the rest of our souls, what we haven't already sold to Apple and H&M and whoever else will end up with. So we can talk about revolution and reform. I would like to talk about that when we talk. I'd like to have more back and forth, but those are some basics.
So I think maybe a good place to start, for those of you who came in late, we're here with Laura Whitehorn and Dean Spade, and what we're going to do now is give Laura and Dean a chance to do a little bit of back and forth together, and then we'll open it up and do some back and forth with everyone else who's here and try to get as many voices as possible into the mix. But I'm going to turn it back over to you two for a little bit.
I have some questions I want to ask you. But you don't have to answer them, but if any of them appeal to you. I mean, I have like a million questions I want to ask you, but yes, is that better? Yeah. So I guess for me, part of it is I feel like it's a really big deal that you've been looking at social movements longer than I have, and you've been involved in a period that I've studied to try to understand strategy. So it's like that's part of why I want to pick your brain so bad. So I guess a few things that come to mind. But again, just whatever you want. So one is like in thinking about abolition, which prison abolition is something I committed to, border abolition. And so to do that, we have to imagine a society that doesn't exile people or kick people out, right? That actually tries to instead reconcile, heal, et cetera. Yet our movements are often spaces and our movement organizations that kick people out, that are really strict about judging people as not being like right on enough in any number of ways. And so that's been a tension for so long. I'm just curious about like your thoughts on how we build movements that act less like a prison society. So that's one. Another one is I just kind of want to know like what you think is going to happen overall. Like, like things are really outrageous and there's like tons of apocalyptic movies and novels and stuff. So I'm just curious about your perspective or even any guesses you ever have or any fantasies. And then the third one is, I guess I'm curious about like your big picture around strategies. Like, are there contemporary strategies you see being practiced that you feel are like innovative or hopeful or really long-term, multiple hundreds of years social movement strategies that you see being practiced? Like, I just went to Palestine for the first time and was really like, it was really hard to be like, wow, people here have tried like a lot of amazing shit and they lose land and water every day. And like, I just was like kind of overwhelmed with thinking about the movement there and the movement in the US and like which things work. And I know you've been involved in like frameworks that are like, part of a period where armed social movement was really discussed and practiced in the United States. And that, of course, has been heavily demonized. But I feel like when you look at sort of those strategies, community organizing strategies, and then like the context of like a growing security culture and growing divides that you were describing in our society, like what are your thoughts about like what works or like, I mean, and it's really vague, but anything I would be curious to hear about.
Those are huge questions.
I know, I'm sorry.
Okay, so the first one, I really agree with you. I mean, I don't belong to an organization. I was part of a period of time when we had Marxist-Leninist organizations, and they were very restrictive, and it was all very much about cadre and then building mass organizations. And I think it was a big mistake to stratify things in that way. So I'm not in an organization. Now I'm in a group, the New York State Task Force for Political Prisoners. It's basically a paper organization. We get together to do things. When a political prisoner is going for parole, we'll do a campaign or something like that. And so I go to movement events. And if I don't know anyone there, I just sit by myself and people talk to their friends, That's one thing. I'm obviously the obverse is what I would think would be better. The other thing is that, and this is great. I mean, at an event like this is a structure that has to work. But in New York, I can't wait to go to an event. Actually, I went to one. There's a group called Queertopia, right? Queerocracy, right? It's a joke, actually. Queerocracy, get it? Not hierarchy. They had an event where I spoke with a number of other people who've done AIDS and prison work, and we sat in a circle. And we started, and we gave our backgrounds, from where are you coming from when you're saying these things? So that people couldn't just, pontificate ideas, but had to say, this is who I am, this is how I came to this, this is where this is based in my experience and my life. And then other people in the circle did the same thing, to compare and contrast. That's the only event I've been out of prison now for 13 years. I think it's the only event I've been to in New York that has been like that. The rest have been panels, and people give talks, and it breaks down as the experts, and then what? The people who have probably just as much experience, same experience, different experience, but something to add. So I think that that's one thing that has to really change. I'm not sure if I can talk about it on a very much more than that. The second question was about...
What's going to happen?
Oh, I don't know. But, I don't know. I'm a very optimistic person because something that really I learned in prison over and over again, but I learned it first in the civil rights movement. I was in grade school in the beginning, and then in high school, junior high school and stuff. And I knew about racism. I grew up in New York, and there was de facto racism and segregation in the schools and all of that. So I knew it existed. And my father would say to me, "Oh, white people just have to change their thinking. That's what has to happen." And when I saw the civil rights movement and the courage of people who were up against the fire hoses and the dogs to me, that's the terrifying thing, to have a dog set on you by a cop. And the courage, that gave me a lot of hope. And that has happened to me over and over again. So in prison, it happened to me when I saw people who had everything taken from them, everything, had lost their kids and could still crack jokes and, fight for their survival. And I see it happening now around, because I am, you sort of have to focus on some issue, even though you think, we have to change everything. But so I have this connection to prisoners and political prisoners, so that's the work I do. And around mass incarceration, I have to say, when I first came out of prison, I would talk to people about prison, and people in the movements would say to me, "Well, what's it like?" And just very basic questions. They had no awareness. And now there was an event in New York 2 weeks ago where there were 2,000 people or more coming to talk about how to destroy the system of mass incarceration, and it was very exciting. And I do see that something has changed. When Michelle Alexander's book came out, there are a lot of weaknesses in it, I think, and shortcomings, but she gave legitimacy to what black prisoners have been saying, what people on the street have been saying, radicals have been saying for years, which is this is the new slavery. So I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. But what's the point of not thinking that we can we can stop the kind of massive incarceration, massive invasion of other countries, that, I hope we can stop the United States and Israel from creating a war with Iran. We just, if we don't have hope, I don't know what we have, but I don't really know, And one thing I've learned from being in all those movements is, as Kate says in the introduction to the wonderful book that was launched last night, we are many, about the Occupy movement. We should all realize we have more questions than answers. And I will tell you, after however many years of being in movements, I have more questions, many more questions than answers. So I have some for you. So first of all, I want to say that in all 14 years in prison, I was once in prison with a trans woman. And at the time I thought, oh, well, I don't know, maybe I'm just in the wrong prisons for that or something. But then after I got out, I talked to trans women who had been in prison, and I realized, oh, duh, because they're sent to men's prisons. And the kind of violence that people go through in that situation is huge. So I wanted to know how you integrate healing into the work that you do with prisoners, number one. Another question I have is that I know that one of the areas that's of gender and law and hate crimes law, which I completely agree with what you said about expanding hate crimes law, very bad idea, is HIV criminalization law, which makes it a crime in I think it's something like 36 states. Some states to have sex, even if you're undetectable, have an undetectable viral load, and use a condom. If you don't tell your partner that you're HIV positive, which how can you prove that you did? So there's a movement to try to to try to dismantle those laws. But how does that relate to the work that you're doing and to the kinds of things you're saying? And the third thing is, in building the alternatives, how do you maintain, which I think is one of the most exciting kinds of work that I see happening. I was just talking to people here who are working on a variety of different alternatives, including setting up workers' cooperatives in some places, which run not just a cooperative within someone else's factory, but a cooperative that actually is a business run by the workers. How do you generalize sometimes those very small projects into a larger sense of how to structure society in more meaningful and revolutionary ways?
Just a few small questions, nothing big. So I mean, I think the question about healing work is a really huge one. One of the things, like, from my personal experience is that that I've noticed is that, like, so in March there was this like pinkwashing tour that the Israeli consulate paid all these gay and lesbian Israeli people to tour the United States, and they came through Seattle where I live, and to like kind of make good. Oh yeah. To make good press for Israel and to say that Israel is like a really great place that loves gay people and don't worry about that whole occupation thing. And so many of us opposed that, and as part of that process, I ended up being the target of like an enormous amount of like really violent hate mail and other public stuff, and I had never had that experience before in quite that way. And it was really interesting to be in that experience, and when it all started happening, I was out of town, and I was really having like an incredibly intense set of emotional things happen, even though I know that I'm like on my path. I'd said things that were true. I had done what I believe is my role as an ally to Palestinian people I had just been visiting. Like I knew what I had done was right, but I felt absolutely horrible. And when I felt better was when I was back with other people who had been through it too. And that just seems to be the continued thing. Like, it's like in our culture, we're told the way to take care of yourself is to like pay for a massage, or, you know what I mean? It's very much like you should buy something, you should escape, you go on vacation to a colonized place, like get away from, you know, not that you don't already live in one, but, you know, get away from things, you know what I mean? And buy something and be very individualized about your healing. But what I think actually heals us is being with others who've been through something similar or the same, or who have shared, and actually getting to like witness each other and work on changing it for ourselves and for people in the future, and like, or others who are going through it. And so that's what I see in all the work we do at SRLP around criminalization, like our Pen Pal program and our Solidarity newsletter, where prisoners and people who are formerly imprisoned in our organization get to like write, and it gets sent to other people, and getting to send things back and forth and make art with each other. Like, that work is both saving people's lives, because it really getting one letter when you have no family connections and you're in prison by yourself for zillions of years facing all this, you know, extreme violence, that is life-saving and meaningful, and can lead to like also having resources to get out and find housing and building relationships on the outside and all of that. But also it's healing for people, I think, on all sides. And like, I think that our movements have sometimes failed to really think about how healing works in them, and how we actually it's like I think sometimes there's been a kind of anti-feminist, like that's too mushy kind of bullshit, you know what I mean? That doesn't really acknowledge us as like full beings, people with like a lot of trauma that we're living with in all of our different roles. So I think a lot more people in the movements I'm part of are really looking at that stuff. And one of the groups that's really leading some of that thinking is that organization Generation 5. Their mission is to end child sexual abuse in 5 generations. And that group, to me, is an example of a group. They know that child sexual abuse is a problem that is absolutely not being solved by criminalization. That there, you know, that no top-down state violence has ever done anything to touch that problem. It makes it worse. And that, you know, child sexual abuse comes from conditions of racism, poverty, colonization, all the, you know, heteropatriarchy. All this stuff is what leads to it. And so their work is really about like actually healing our communities and our own selves and lives, and seeing people who do harm often as people who've been through violence, and that really just shifts the whole mode of what our task is. So to me, that work is really, really inspiring. HIV criminalization, I mean, it's such an example of how we produce demonization in a prison society, right? Demonization that combines like homophobic and racist images. It's one of the things that I actually first got really politicized about during the Newshawn Williams case. Some of the people I did activism with around that are here in the room, you know, in the 90s. And just, you know, it was this idea about like this monster. They created this, the headlines were AIDS monster. And I think that is like a key site of decriminalization, because it gives us a chance to look at this perpetual production of monsters that our society depends on, that isn't the only way for us to organize ourselves. And then we get to look inside our movements and see, how do we create monsters? Because I think also feminist movements have created monsters of people who are, you know, engaged in sexual assault and other things that have not been productive for us and have sucked us into criminalization strategies. And the last thing on how to build alternatives and how to maintain alternatives and generalize them out. I think that's actually one of the hardest questions, right? Like, because our local models in our particular communities don't generalize out necessarily. Like, what works for a certain group of people, it's often based in the culture of that community, like whether or not you have food at your meetings, how important that is, or whether or not you do a go-around, or whether or not that seems really stupid to people. Or, I mean, I see that a lot in the groups I work with, because also I've moved around the country a lot in the last few years, and in different cities, meeting culture is totally different, and it's not the right idea to try to push a meeting culture, even in different neighborhoods, right, or in different racial communities or religious communities. It just works differently, and you've got to work with what you have. So how do we both tell each other about our models so people know that there's other ways to do your housing or to do your food or to do like healing from violence that happens in the community, but not try to push, like, because that's what the state does. The state is all about standardizing something across the entire territory and saying this is what language is, this is what money is, this is what, right, like that's what stateness is. And so we instead want like really local, specific models, but we also want to share our wisdom, and I think that's something that we struggle with, and that like new media could be useful for, but often isn't for some reason. Yeah. So I'm always trying to figure that out. Like, do we need to meet live with each other, like across regions, to figure out these models? Do we read each other's books? Do people read books anymore? These are some of my questions that are like, I think, a struggle. But you want to?
I think maybe if it's okay with the two of you, so we started a little bit late. We're going to run a little bit late. I already checked it with the next speaker. But I think what we'll do is open it up for about 10 minutes of questions. And I think if it's all right, the easiest way to do this, or maybe the best way to do this, would be to take 2 questions at a time, and then have you just respond. Is that okay?
More, so more people get to talk.
Okay, so maybe we'll take 3 questions and then have you give a response, and then another set of 3 questions. So, questions? Dave? Dave, will you come up and use the microphone so that we can get it on the camera? I'm sorry. Do you want to just do that?
My main issues have been anti-war in prison, but more and more I've come to identify capitalism as the main problem, and to feel very good about studying Marxism, building socialism, and the traditional studies, movements and histories that have identified capitalism as a problem. Their tactics, what we can do.
Okay, so other questions? Do you want to come up to the mic? Sorry. Questions or comments? Yes, they don't have to be questions.
I just have a question. The company that I work for, many times we have people who come out of prison and we employ them, and so many times I've seen is that this is such an opportunity that they have, and I don't mean to get back in society, but to be able to be self-independent. And all they have to do is come to work on time and do a good job, and they don't. They don't show up, or they just quit. So how can you help someone who has an opportunity like that?
Questions or comments? Maybe get one more. Do you want to come up to the mic so we can hear you? I'm sorry. You can also just yell really loudly if you'd prefer. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
The conditions. Hi, thank you so much, both of you, for being here. It's a pleasure to hear both of you speak. And I live in the city, and we have a community organization, and in our city we are facing crime. Well, in our community we're facing crime, and in the city. And I was wondering, how can a small community organization implement the kinds of overarching problems and solutions that you provide and really address them at a smaller scale? Because when we have a problem, we're told to call 911. And we've had SWAT teams come and helicopters come overhead. And at one point, just last week, one neighbor, they got the house wrong, and the police dragged him and his pregnant wife out and realized they had the wrong house. So I would really love to hear your solutions for that.
And I think there was one more hand over here somewhere. Did I see one more hand? All right, so we're going to go with those three then.
Okay, I'll jump in first. Okay, so on capitalism, I completely agree with you, Dave, and that's where I started out actually as in my career. When I talk about revolution, we're talking about overthrowing capitalism and putting something else. And I'm still a socialist, but I think it needs very much like what Dean was just saying about local conditions, creating what happens in a program. I think that with socialism, that's absolutely what has to happen. It only works if it meets. My view of mass incarceration, the imprisonment of political prisoners, the structure of the prison system, is that it is there in order to allow the capitalists to continue to function. I mean, you know, everyone goes, yeah, okay, the 99%, okay, they have so much money, blah, blah, blah. Why is it still happening? Well, it's still happening because the people are repressed to the extent there's such an internal and external repression that otherwise there would be uprisings too. So to me, that is the issue, and that's the way it ties together. And that's one of the reasons why I believe that in everyone's work, whatever it is, whether it's with prisons or not, there should be some relationship to people in prison and to getting those voices into the conversation and also to working to end mass incarceration. And I should have been clearer about that. You know, I can't answer your question because I don't know the individuals, because they're individuals. They're not like, you know, a class. They were individuals before they went to prison. And, you know, I'm now an ex-prisoner. There are a lot of labels you could call me. I'm a lesbian, I'm a Jew, I'm a dyke, I'm a, you know, to some people I'm a self-hating Jew because I support Palestine, whatever. But I'm me, you know. And I think when I got out of prison, I needed a lot of help to get to my job every day. I had the support of, now she's gone somewhere, but a partner who, you know, was without whom I couldn't take a step at the time. I had only been in for 14 years, and when I say only, it's because I work now with a wonderful guy who was in for 40 years. And maybe the structure of your company doesn't recognize what the exact problems are that they face. I don't know. I can't really answer that. But I will say that I bet you anything you've had other employees who haven't shown up for work too, who weren't ex-prisoners. And that's the other thing about the targeting of people as being ex-prisoners. But I have to say, keep hiring people, okay? Because that's one of the things that happens to people when they get out of prison. I was really lucky because, and I always said it, I was a white, middle-class, college-educated woman when I got arrested, and I was when I got out. And I know that that meant that I had a much easier time of everything than I would have been if I had not been those in that privileged category. And on the last thing, you know, I think that is the big question, is how do we replace the police in dealing with the problems that really, you know, rend our communities. I walk around with my stop and frisk button because that's part of our campaign in New York against the horrible policing of Black and Latino youth, which is stop and frisk. And I get stopped, especially on 125th Street when I go into Harlem. I get stopped by Black men who say to me, you know, you don't live in my community. I'm scared of the kids in my community. I mean, there's crime in every community. I have a few tiny examples I can offer to you from friends of mine who live in Bed-Stuy, and they offered two things. One was, there was a guy who owned a little deli, and he was letting drug dealers distribute out of his store. And so my friends joined the block committee of their block, and the block committee was ready to call the cops on this guy. And my friends were able to convince the block committee to wait. and to let, not the women, but the men, they knew that the guy wasn't going to listen to the women, go and talk to this guy and not exactly threaten him. They weren't threatening him with violence. They just said to him, look, you have a choice. Our kids are around here. You have a choice. Respect us, respect this community, and stop doing this, or people are going to call the cops on you, and we will not defend you. And he stopped. You know, it was amazing. The other thing that they did was, in order to make an argument that the police didn't have to be standing along Flatbush Avenue, you know, threatening people coming off the subway, they started having people go and walk people home at night to avoid the police. Two tiny things. I think the first point, though, is for people to try to intervene. And I know that's really hard and it's really dangerous. So I think that's why I think it's pie in the sky if we're saying, oh yeah, we can replace the police right now. I think it's a long process. The process of policing has disempowered all of us from making decisions about our own safety. And that there needs to be a process. But I think pulling a community together, pulling together meetings, and discussing different possible strategies, creative strategies, is one step. Dean probably has other ideas because you do more of this kind of alternative building work than I do.
Yeah, I'll just say a few things. I mean, one thing I think about thank you. It's so hard to remember. I mean, one thing I think about the capitalism question is I just think for me, like I came to politics as like a white person who grew up on welfare. So my first relationship to politics was seeing everything through the lens of class and capitalism. And I had to really work with understanding the centrality of white supremacy. So that for me, it's really important that we don't talk about those things as only being in service of each other, but that they both are like, white supremacy often is really expensive and they do it anyway. You know what I mean? Like it has its own life, and so I think it's always for me, like as a white person, trying to not reduce things to capitalism, because I think there's a tendency for a lot of white people to sideline the role of white supremacy. And then the other thing about this sort of socialism question that just relates to what we were talking about is like I do think there's a danger that people all over the world are fighting for land, they're fighting for the end of state violence against them, they're fighting for the opportunity to make decisions about their own lives. And a lot of forms of socialism have not really been about that. So it's like, how do we really think about something that lets us make decisions about our own lives? And it made me think about the other person's question about people who come to his job and come late and stuff, prisoners who come late. Like, what is it about work that makes people hate it so much and not want to go? And why are so many people in our culture having such a hard time getting out of bed and going to work? You know, it's a really big deal. And so I was reading these things about factory takeovers, mostly in Latin America, where people like take over their own factories and then people report like, and they even out the wages, and people are like, yeah, I just want to stay all day because I just like love my people I work with and I love talking to people and I get to do the part of the work I like more and I get to like, and you know what I mean? Like, and we're not all in lockdown and we don't have a boss. So it turns out people do like making stuff. People even like cleaning stuff, and we all do these things. But when we do them for wages with a boss, we really fucking hate it. So that's an interesting thing to think about, is like, you know, when people, I don't know, and I think that's a question, is like maybe what kinds of ways do we like to collaborate that look nothing like what work is right now? Because I think that it's easy to like judge people for not having an easy time showing up for that, even though most of us only can show up for that if we've been like, have the most privileged positions or been endlessly trained on it or whatever, or really terrified not to. And then the last thing about how to, what? He left, that's cool. He heard this good thing that Laura was saying. And then I'll just say that how can we implement solutions around crime? So the things I'm most excited about partly are the preventative stuff people are doing, because it's so, I mean, obviously we also need responsive stuff, but I feel like some people, it seems like, are kind of getting together and then identifying strategic areas, like particular things that are happening, like if it's drug trade on that block, or I think a lot of groups I've been working with are identifying sexual violence as one of the things that justifies the existence of policing, but that is not solved by policing, and then figuring out like what are the solutions we want to do. And so for me, I've been excited by strategies that are preventative. And where I live in Seattle, we're trying to stop them from building a new youth jail. And our whole frame is like, you can spend millions of dollars on this youth jail, or you can spend money on childcare for the parents of these youth who are ending up in this jail because they're like hanging out of school, like spend money on arts programs, all the things that would actually prevent this, right? And instead, the model of the criminal justice reformers in Seattle is like, you should have to get arrested to get drug treatment, you should have to get arrested to get mental health care, you know? So, and in Washington State, where I live, they used fourth graders' test scores to decide how many prison beds to build, right? That's like a very typical thing in a lot of states. That's how they do the math of how many prisoners we're gonna have. So they're setting up your prison bed when you're in fourth grade and having a hard time in school. They're not doing anything about your school, you know, they're not doing anything about what's going on at home. And so I guess for me, it's like, how can we think in the opposite way of the way the state thinks about violence, which is we think about prevention. And then also we do need to respond. And I am really inspired by people who stop and frisks when they see them happening. It's really scary. We need to support those people who are now facing charges for that, and by people who are willing to intervene. I think a lot of us are always trying to figure that out. Just when you see somebody like some guy like hurting his girlfriend on the street in front of you, how do you touch base? How do you say like, hey, do you need any help? Are you going to make it worse for her? You know, like these are questions that I think we actually need to work on in a really local way, and often in our neighborhood blocks is the right spot, because that's the place where you have those like ongoing day-to-day relationships. That book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, is some of the stories of people trying to do that stuff. But I think that's like, there's not an answer, but there's also like a million little answers about like how do we, because we've all tried intervening on harm, often in our families, like you can't hit your brother or whatever, and we've also forgiven people and we've also been forgiven. So we know something about alternatives to exile and imprisonment and caging people when they do something wrong, but we feel like we don't know alternatives. And we feel like we don't know how to prevent. I mean, we're really deep in it. So I feel like it's just an experimentation and like seeing other people's experiments and seeing if any part of it works.